I'm standing next to our model of the Victory, which is of course in Nelson's niche. The Victory, probably one of the most famous ships in the British Navy, was Nelson's flagship at the very decisive Battle of Trafalgar, which took place on the 21st of October 1805. Celebrated even today with Trafalgar Day, by the way. It was a decisive victory of the British Navy over the combined fleets of France and Spain, and it had long-lasting and significant impact on the history of Europe. At that time, Napoleon had his army massed in France and was expecting and waiting to invade England. As a protection from the British Navy, he required his fleet and his fleet of his allies, the Spanish, to send a force north from the Mediterranean up the coast of Portugal into the English Channel, and to ensure that there were no British warships that were going to interfere with his invasion across the Channel, which of course would have taken several days. I think his army massed over 200,000 men, and to transport them in comparatively small ships across the Channel would have taken several days, and of course they would have been quite vulnerable. So he required his fleet to sail north to make sure there were no British ships able to interfere with him. The British got wind of this and dispatched Nelson and his squadron to intercept them, which they did as they came out of the Mediterranean and turned northward to go up the Channel. Nelson's squadron spotted them. Nelson divided his fleet into two. He took one half, his deputy, if you like, Lord Collingwood, took the other. And they approached the French in a most unconventional manner, in two lines of force. He took the windward column and Collingwood the leeward column, and they advanced against the combined fleets at right angles, which was quite unconventional. They cut through the lines, which therefore cut the combined fleet into three sections, and of course these were all sailing ships. Those that were in the vanguard of the combined fleet had a difficult task to turn around and come back to join the battle. So it had quite a significant impact on the combined fleets, and Nelson was able to defeat them. That of course meant that Bonaparte's invasion ambitions were dashed, and he turned around and marched eastward and invaded Russia instead, and we all know that that did not have a very happy outcome for him. So Britain was saved from an invasion, and it subsequently led to Napoleon being severely weakened in Europe. The ship itself was launched in 1756. She was built in Chatham, which is on the River Medway. She was built of oak, though her keel is of elm. Took somewhere about 6 years to build, employed a workforce of around 250 shipwrights, consumed the wood from around 6,000 oak trees, and that was just for the hull. Of course, the masts and yards were primarily of pine, which was lighter, straighter, and more flexible. Weighed something over 2,000 tons, but having been launched, there was no immediate role for her, so she idled at anchor on the Medway for about 13 years. And it was only when another first-rate ship of the line, the Indefatigable, ran aground and couldn't be refloated, had to be dismantled, that there was need for another first-rate ship to replace her, and so the Victory was brought out of reserve and brought into commission. She was a first-rate ship. The British Navy was divided into 6 rates, basically divided along the number of guns they had. First rates had 100 or more, second rates 90 to 100, third rates anywhere from 65 to 90, and so on down to the 6th rates, which had as few as 4 and perhaps as many as 20. First and second rate ships had 3 gun decks, third and fourth rate ships had 2 gun decks, and fifth and sixth had only 1. The guns on the Victory, 104 of them, were in 3 weights, and the weight described the weight of the cannonball they fired. The biggest guns were 32-pounders. There were 30 of them arranged on the lower deck. They weighed in excess of 3.5 tons, complete with their massive wooden carriage on which they rested. So there was a lot of weight, and the ideal was to carry the heaviest weight as low in the ship as you could. So the 32-pounders were consigned to the lowest deck. The middle deck had slightly smaller guns, still very heavy, but slightly smaller. She had 28 24-pounders on the middle deck, and the upper deck, and this included the poop deck, which is at the very back of the ship, and the forecastle, which is in the front of the ship. She had about 40 12-pounders. In addition, she carried 4 carronades, which were an even heavier caliber, projecting a missile weighing over 64 pounds, but short range, massive. They would deliver a massive blow, but over a comparatively short range. 104 guns in all, quite a lot of firepower. Overall, she was 226 feet long, 52 feet in the beam. The top of the main mast towered some 205 feet above the waterline. The bowsprit, which some people categorize as another mast, by the way, projected some 100 or so feet out of the front of the ship. So to the 220 odd feet in length, you could add around 100 feet for the bowsprit. She was ship-rigged, square sails on each of the masts, massive sails, very, very heavy. One of the sails, by the way, from the action in 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar, survives to this very day. It's a sail from the foremast. It measures 54 feet across the top, 80-something feet across the bottom, and 50-odd feet from top to bottom, and weighed something like 1,500 pounds. Now imagine that, having to be manhandled by seamen. And the seamen, or topmen as they were called, were the ones who went aloft to either set the sails or to change the setting of them by taking in a reef or two that would have made the sail a little smaller. There would have been another large number of seamen on the deck, of course hauling on the lines which controlled the raising or lowering of the sails, as well as the set of the yard arms, which had to be rotated somewhat to take advantage of the direction of the wind. Could be set with as many as 35 sails. They carried spares, of course, in the event of loss or damage in a storm or enemy action. Carried, I believe, another 23 spare sails, but a full set of sails on the Victory comprised 35 sails, and as I say, very heavy, very cumbersome. When she went into battle in 1805, she carried a complement of about 850 men. Not all seamen, a great number of them were Marines, because these ships in those days were basically floating castles. So a lot of Marines but a lot of seamen, some of whom were topmen, and some would have been the guys who hauled on the lines on the deck level. Plus, of course, a great number of boys. The boys would have been employed mainly for scuttling between the guns and the magazine room to collect gunpowder and shot and carry it to the guns. Now, what makes Victory particularly special is that she exists today. She is in fact the oldest serving ship in the world. I think she probably is the oldest surviving sailing ship in the world. She's now in dry dock in Portsmouth, England, which is on the south coast, is a major naval centre. She's in dry dock since 1922. Now, in point of fact, she nearly was scrapped in about 1903 because, having survived the Battle of Trafalgar and been severely damaged there and repaired, and of course went back into service, eventually her role diminished. She was at various times used for storage and even as a hospital ship at one point. But by the early 1900s, she had fallen into such sad disrepair, there were serious plans to scrap her. It was in fact the wife of one of the senior admirals in the British Navy who implored her husband not to sign the order which would have consigned Victory to the scrapyard. So she was saved and preserved for the nation and floated until 1922, when the cost of maintenance became so prohibitive that it was decided to put her into dry dock. And she is now in dry dock and sits at an angle and height above the water where the dockyard would represent sea level. She's a museum, but is also a serving ship in the Royal Navy. Hence you will see here she carries the white ensign on the stern. She's particularly beloved, of course, by the British because she was Nelson's ship. And this is what makes this particular area, in my opinion, so interesting, in that we have the man and the ship, and they're both well known and well documented, and there are many stories about them. Nelson was a man who had a very prominent role in the British Navy. He was only 47 when he died, and at that point he was Lord of the Realm, as well as being an admiral, and combined, as I say, was in charge of the fleet that took on the Spanish-French fleet. He died aboard the Victory on the 21st of October 1805. He was resplendent on the deck in his full dress uniform when he must have made a fairly easy target for one of the snipers on one of the French ships. The snipers would have been the equivalent of the British Marines, would have been positioned on what were called the fighting tops. These are the platforms that you will see on the masts here. They call them the tops, and when they would send Marines to them, of course, hence the name, the fighting tops. So they would have sharpshooters and musket men up there firing at the personnel on opposing ships. Nelson, who would have been, I imagine, a fairly prominent target in his frock coat with gold epaulets and his orders of his honours and orders on his breast, would have been a fairly prominent target, as I say, and was hit by a musket ball on his left shoulder. It actually broke part of his epaulet, went in through his shoulder, through his chest, lodged in his spine. Very fatal injury, but it took 4 hours or thereabouts to kill him. He was carried below to the orlop deck, which was below the lowest gun deck. The orlop deck, which is where the surgeon operated, he was carried down there. There was very little could be done for him, and he died of blood loss about 4 hours later. Now this is in the day when communication was slow and communication could only be carried out basically by ships carrying messages, other than by the signal flags. Now signal flags were interesting. They were introduced with a code by a Commodore Popham of the British Navy, who in 1800 introduced a list of about 1,000 words, each with a number, 1,000 words from which you had to compose a message. Now this was added to, I think, in 1803 and again in 1804, so there were probably around 3,000 words, and in some instances phrases that could be conveyed by use of a number. So that, of course, was the way ships signaled to one another, and of course Nelson issued his famous exhortation to the crews of his ship that England expected every man to do his duty, and indeed they did. Nelson was struck down while standing just forward of the mizzenmast. If I can get my little laser thing to work here, just forward of the mizzenmast, and if you go on to the Victory, it's in dry dock in Portsmouth, as I said. Here, the spot where he was believed to have stood when he was struck by this musket ball is recorded in a little brass plate on the deck. He was, of course, brought back to England. In those days, prior to refrigeration, he had to be preserved, supposedly in a lead coffin with spirits in there that would have preserved him, and he eventually was returned to England very early January 1806, which was 2.5 months after his death. So when he got to England, of course, a state funeral was planned for him, and no less a place than St Paul's Cathedral. So if any of you have ventured to London, have been in St Paul's Cathedral, immediately below the dome of St Paul's in the crypt is the tomb of Admiral Lord Nelson. Massive funeral for him, and of course he had to be buried in the greatest possible pomp. And in what should they bury him? Happily, we have to go back to the time of Henry VIII and Henry VIII's favourite, Cardinal Wolsey. Incredibly powerful statesman in England under Henry VIII. And at the height of his power, he brought from Italy a large block of Italian marble and an Italian sculptor. And he had this sculptor carve from this black marble the sarcophagus, which would have been his ultimate resting place. Sadly for Cardinal Wolsey, he fell out of favour with Henry VIII. As you know, he was unable to get satisfactory arrangements for Henry VIII to divorce his wives as he saw fit, and so Cardinal Wolsey lost favour, and in fact was on his way to London. So when Nelson was returned in the beginning of 1806 to Britain, a massive state funeral was planned for him, and it was to be in St Paul's Cathedral. We have to go back now to Henry VIII, and Henry VIII had a favourite, Cardinal Wolsey, who was a very prominent statesman and who unfortunately fell out with Henry when he was unable to make satisfactory arrangements with the Pope for Henry's divorces. So he fell out of power. Now at the height of his power, he had ordered in from Italy a massive block of black Italian marble and an Italian sculptor to carve it into a sarcophagus, which he intended to be used for his funeral, which he imagined would be a very grand affair. For whatever reasons, he fell out with Henry and lost his power, and was in fact on his way to London to face charges of treason when he died. Was moved to Windsor and put into storage there, and there it stayed from the mid-1500s for 250 years until, for the state funeral of Admiral Lord Nelson, of course they needed something grand, so they dug out the sarcophagus from Windsor to be used for him. So if you venture down into the crypt at St Paul's and you look at the tomb to Admiral Lord Nelson, you would see this amazing large black sarcophagus, and therein lie the mortal remains of England's great national hero, Admiral Lord Nelson, and Britain is of course immensely proud of him. And what makes it so interesting is the fact that his whereabouts is known and his ship still exists. And that's one of the things that I think makes Victory and Nelson such an engaging story.